Good evening, everyone. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for joining us this evening. Do I see anybody I know? I always like to have a look and see what familiar faces join us. Lots of familiar faces, always good to see. Hi, Tom. Hi, Tracy. Francesca, nice to see you again. Lots of familiar faces. I love it. We always say our face-to-face training presentations. I hope everybody's here for the right event. I hope everybody's come to the right place. So welcome, everybody. Let's talk board governance crisis is our topic this evening. So hopefully that's what you're all here for. We have a fantastic panel for you. Just a few hints and tips to start you off. You are very welcome to introduce yourselves through the chat function. We have the Q&A function. So there's two separate functions there. The Q&A function, if you want to ask any questions of our panelists during the presentation, pop them into the Q&A box, not the chat box. And then you can give a thumbs up if there's a particular question you feel strongly about, and we will try and pick those up as we go along. All right. So I'm going to introduce a couple of people just to start off. So hopefully everybody knows the Let's Talk series. It's all about discussing difficult topics, often hidden in plain sight. So Rena has been our champion of the Let's Talk series, our vice chair of IoD Central London branch. I'm going to hand over to Rena to do introductions.
Thank you so much, Keith. It's absolutely a delightful experience to be here once again talking about a topic that I'm extremely passionate about. And I know that this is a conversation that needs to be spoken in full depth and width. And I've got a great panel with me today who are going to be talking about board governance crisis. And is there a crisis? And what might we do around it? So looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to everyone. Great to see new faces, old faces, known faces, and looking forward to connecting with each one of you during the conversation today. The Let's Talk series is quite interesting because we are hoping that the panelists are going to trigger a conversation with you. So as you can see, the design of the conversation is, while we have a webinar for an hour, which does include an opportunity for you to have questions answered, we also have a VIP roundtable, and a Zoom link is going to be shared with you at 7 o'clock. And I'd love you to join us back and have another deeper conversation and share your views and opinions on what must be done to make board governance much more stronger and effective. So what's the plan for today? Keith and I are going to just take you through the steps. Keith, would you like me to go through the agenda for today?
I'll do that. I'll fly through these few slides
Okay.
and I'll hand back to you. So yes, so we'll have a look at IoD for those of you who aren't members. We'll do a little bit of introduction. I'll hand back to Rena for that. Then we will have the discussion. So I'm also pleased to introduce, I will introduce shortly Nzube, who's joining us, another volunteer ambassador with the IoD. So I'll get Nzube to introduce himself shortly as well. So Nzube and Rena will moderate discussions, heated discussions, I'm sure, around the board governance crisis. And then we will look to move into the round table, as always supported by Amanda from the IoD London team. Up next. So yes, let's talk an IoD London Business Extra. So a new name for new times. This is just a basic overview of IoD London and the program about high profile webinars and what we are delivering to you from IoD. So providing business leadership and networking in London. So although we're virtual and face-to-face nowadays, there's all sorts of options, but it's all about giving you opportunities to network and learn, engage with each other through all those platforms. Authoritative, influential and insightful, diverse, dynamic and interactive, all those buzzwords, and hopefully we can deliver some of that this evening as well. So for those of you, these are open to members and non-members. I'm sure those of you who are members will fully support me in providing the benefits of the IoD membership. So I myself have used the information advisory service and cannot praise it enough. There's all sorts of business options for you, personal options as well. The professional development courses are unsurpassed, giving you amazing opportunities and qualifications. We talk to government. Dr. Roger Barker is on the panel this evening and leads our governance team who speak to government on a regular basis. And we have our special interest groups as well, who are becoming centres of excellence in their areas of expertise. So look out for all of that, and you'll get the most direct information as members. So make sure you log on to IoD.com and sign up. So myself, I am the volunteer membership ambassador for IoD Central London branch. You've heard from Rina as interim chair. So I'll ask Nzube to introduce himself as Young Executive Forum lead.
Sure, thank you. And it's great to be here. When Rina and I first met to discuss a potential topic, I was really excited when we settled on corporate governance. I'm passionate about that. So as a quick intro, I'm Nzube Ufodike, and I work as an investment director with corporate ventures, accelerators, and direct SME clients, supporting and leading on fundraising strategy, investor relationships, deal structuring, and negotiations. My primary responsibility is working with investors to close on capital. And within the IoD, I serve as a volunteer and chair of the Young Executives Special Interest Group. That's part of the IoD London region. Looking forward to the conversations today. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Nzube.
you.
And I'm going to hand back over to Rina.
Thank you. And without further ado, let me welcome and very quickly introduce my panelists to you. If I was to do a full introduction, I could take the next 1 hour. So I'm going to keep it really brief and short, and you will see the power of their conviction and what they have to say when we get into the conversation. We're joined today by Abi Aida. Welcome, Abi. Thank you so much for joining us. Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, Rina. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to a nice, vibrant discussion. Thank you.
Indeed, indeed. Abi is a trained economist, and he has got more than 35 years experience playing multiple roles, and he's chairman right now, and absolutely the right person to have a conversation on this one. So delighted to have him. We also have Ethel here with us today. Ethel, hi, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Hello, Rina. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Ethel Tambuzai. I'm founder of Tambu Group, a business consultancy that specializes in business strategy, business development, but also governance support. So helping with shareholder KYC, due diligence, but also review of processes and effectiveness of boards. So.
Thank you, Ethel. And Ethel is also doing an MSc in corporate governance and business ethics. So again, we're going to get some real insights and research and some anecdotes that will bring this conversation to life. We also have Hatvish Newins with us here. Hatvish, hi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Rina. I'm glad to be here. So indeed, I have 2 hats. I'm the CEO of the International Banking Federation, headquartered in London, very nearby your own offices. And second, I'm the chair of European Women on Boards, representing board directors in the whole of Europe. And we just agreed with the Institute of Directors UK to partner. So it's my pleasure to be part of your panel today.
I am so delighted to hear that update, Hatvish. I know that's something that we've been working towards, so it's absolutely great news. Hatvish comes with over 3 decades of experience and is such an advocate for gender diversity and inclusion at the board level, so really looking forward to her views as well. Last but not the least, Roger Baker. Absolutely delighted to have you again on my panel. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you so much, Rina. It's really good to be here. And as Keith said, I'm responsible for policy activities at the IoD. But I have to admit that my real passion is governance, corporate governance, and everything that goes with it. So I'm really delighted to be talking about this topic today.
Oh, fantastic. Absolutely. We're going to get great insights from there. And Roger, you'd be very delighted to know that I've started my Chartered Director qualification. And so I'm really all prepped up. I've done my session on role of board and chair, and hopefully I can bring in some of those insights. So thank you for that. Great. So we've got this amazing panel here. So let's kickstart and having some questions. And the way we'll run it is I've got some nice questions and I'm going to get some of them to debate with each other on it, because we really want to unpack the topic without any judgment to begin with, so that we understand what the issue might be. And then we'll move into some of the best practices that are emerging around it, and then invite your questions from the audience. So don't forget your questions in the Q&A box for us. Let's start at the beginning, the word board governance. And I'm going to invite Roger and Hatfish to comment on these questions. What do we mean when we use the word board governance? It's being said so much at this moment of time. That's one part of the conversation I want you to unpack. And also, one of the things that I was reminded when I did my role of board and chair session is the role and responsibility and accountability of the board. And there's always this whole thing is that if a company is doing well or the long-term success, what's the role of the board and what's the role of the executive team, and who really is responsible? Who should we hold accountable in the public eye? So help us unpack these two topics. Roger, would you like to begin?
Yes, certainly, Rina. Well, some people ask me, how come you're so interested in corporate governance? I mean, surely corporate governance is all about box ticking, compliance. It's all the sort of boring aspects of business. But I realized some time ago, actually, when I was working in banking, that governance held the key to business behavior, corporate behavior. Why is it that companies behaved in the way that they did? Why did they set themselves the particular objectives that they did? It was all about governance. And of course, at the heart of governance lies the board of directors. And organizations, corporate entities need to have a board of directors, because you've got to have human beings who ultimately are going to be accountable for that organization. Corporate entities, limited companies, other types of organization, they can't think for themselves. They are simply legal concepts. They exist on paper, but they don't have consciences. They don't have a mind which can actually make decisions. It can only be human beings that make those decisions. And the human beings which corporate law has decided will actually be held legally accountable for their organizations are the directors, not the management, not shareholders, but the board of directors. So the board of directors is at the heart of governance. But I think, in a kind of classic structure, you have the board of directors that is legally responsible, and they hire a bunch of managers headed up by the CEO, who they delegate a lot of responsibility to and then hold them to account. But of course, in many organizations, particularly SMEs, that distinction between the board, management, shareholders is blurred. Often you have the same people wearing multiple hats. And this, I think, is the big challenge of board governance for SMEs, to actually distinguish the board role from all of the other responsibilities that people are fulfilling. Because it's only as a board member that ultimately you're going to be held legally responsible. And that is why I think it's essential for SMEs to carve out board meetings, formal board meetings, which are minuted. And it's also an incredibly useful step for them actually to move to appointing non-executive directors, particularly a non-executive chairman or chairwoman at some stage in their evolution, who can actually oversee those board meetings and make that very clear distinction that this is a board activity rather than just a management activity or a shareholder based decision. But ultimately, it's up to the board to define the values, make the key decisions, be held to account for what the company does. So a really central role, I think, in any type of governance.
Absolutely. And you're already peeling out a really important point that ultimately it is the board that is responsible. And no matter why they might delegate some of the responsibilities and some of the work that needs to be done, ultimately they are the people who need to be held responsible. Hatfish, do you want to add on to those comments that Roger has shared as well?
Yes, and Roger, thank you so much, because of course you have said it all. Perhaps I can give a concrete example, because not everyone in this room is a board director already. So some of us are aspiring to become a board of director. And I would say The board structure is very much something that has been invented to make corporates more sound and resilient. That's the whole idea. Why do you need two bodies? It's a little bit like in politics. It is something called checks and balances. And that's a very sound principle that you have in life as well. When you only have one body responsible, that's not good practice. So they invented that two driving wheel scenario, and Roger said it all. The board of directors at the end is responsible, but not everything is easy in life. You have those executives who really are digging on the wheel, on the driving. They know, they have all the papers, they are executive. So they are really much doing the work. And then you have the board of directors who are ultimately responsible, but they are non-executive. So what is so interesting in that thing is that at the same time, being a board of director is a very, very important topic, but the way you need to do it is different than perhaps you've been doing in your expert life, in your management life. And that's where IoD is coming in, to make that transition smooth and to explain to potential board directors or NEDs how it works and what is their responsibility.
Fabulous. And it becomes so much more important, as both of you are pointing out, the minute you start thinking about SMEs, because in large organizations, it's perhaps easier to have these distinguished different teams, but here the blurring of lines take place. So sometimes people need to wear different hats. And the minute you talk about people, it is really up to the wisdom and interpretation of people, and which is why sometimes we have best practices and sometimes we have failures that are taking place. And some might say that we are in the state we are today on a lot of counts because of board governance that really never happened when it should have happened. So I'm curious to kind of bring this concept a bit more to life, and I'd like to invite Ethel and Abhi, and I'm going to kind of get them to talk two sides. So best practices from you, Ethel, where you think that it's really working, especially if you have any around the SME entrepreneurship space. And Abhi, would like you to be able to share some live examples of where it went wrong at a board level and what the implications were. So Abhi, do you want to go first?
Okay, thank you. Positive where it went wrong. Okay, I want to encourage people, I think, first of all, because Roger actually touched on a lot of important topics in terms of the governance structure and what it is. And in the lead up to this, you said really, it's not really about live cases, it's about that the growth and development of a business usually follows very similar cycles. And what having governance in place very early on is that it builds a foundation and a framework within which you can operate. Particularly important, I mean, for me, I chair an over 60-year-old company, and at the same time, a company that's an SME that's under 3 years old. So I see both sides. One is private, one is a PLC. So there are certain links between good governance practice and the long-term success of a business. And they usually have to do with scale and how it is. The pressures in building up a business is usually a founder's, dream or whatever it is, and they attract like minds. But as you achieve scale, you have to replicate, and the levers of control have to be distanced and everything. And that process in and of itself, which is why you really need strong guardrails. A train doesn't need guardrails when it's on land, but when it's going over a narrow, high bridge, you may suddenly see some emerge, not that it particularly does. That is the concept of corporate governance, and it's so important for SMEs and especially people in businesses coming up to understand that the best governance practices in the world don't guarantee long-term success. You still have to have a good business that meets the need out there. But what definitely you will not achieve as the success that perhaps you deserve is if you have poor governance practices, because the outcomes and the decisions are driven by other factors than what is best for the organization. Roger touched on that. The organization is distinct. It may not have a conscience, but it's a living, breathing being, and you develop a culture for it. And that culture is actually what you try to monetize or get consideration for, because businesses are who they're the people behind them. it's something to remember that one, you can attract funding, you can attract business, all the indices of scale and being a long-term success and being sustainable all come back to that foundation of good corporate governance, because your decisions are better and you realize that the organization is a long-term thing, that's the plan, and therefore you want good decision making at every stage continually, and it sort of takes care of itself, the business at that point in time. So that's probably what I do. Failures are easy to predict. A lot of the time, sometimes they're not due to governance, but very often there may have been governance issues and challenges in it. And it's something you see if you read the Sunday Times business section when they're talking about organization, especially driven by individuals who are driven and high-powered, which is what a lot of the entrepreneurial story and is the lay of the land now. A lot of people have ideas and they can actually cultivate and build businesses out of them. When it's wrapped up that tightly, it becomes very difficult because the same impulses and motivations that make it successful don't necessarily lend themselves to governance. And I think that's what I'd like to touch on initially. Thank you.
That's great, Abby, absolutely great. And it's great that you're unpacking already some impact that take place on decision-making, the long-term success of organizations, and indeed, how do you manage this entire blurring of lines and grays that are there? Because, you know, business is not simple, it's not black and white, and decisions have to be taken very wisely, looking at all the stakeholders that get impacted as well. Ethel, would you like to throw some light as well on best practices that are emerging in the boardroom or not for that matter?
For sure. So thank you so much for that, Abby. And picking up from what everybody here said, I think good governance is always highlighted by having clear lines of accountability. So you know who's leading the organization, but you know who's executing it, and you know there's a good audit trail usually of the decisions that have been made, and the risks that are also accompanying each of those decisions. But you have you're able to have a good discussion at the round table, rather than what's often considered as groupthink, where everybody's thinking the same thing, is coming from the same background, or people all want the same thing, which is a sustainable organization, which often is making profit as a business. But beyond that, what's the role of that organization in society are some of the wider questions that boards are thinking about. And especially following on from last year with the wake of Black Lives Matter, is really thinking about what role do we want to play in society as a corporate organization. So I think boards aren't just there to think about profit. I'm very much somebody who thinks about the stakeholder model of governance, which is how does an organization position itself in society, but also how is it playing to contribute to its employees, for example, as stakeholders, its leadership, but also the environment as a key role in that. To start off there, and I think also thinking about the next generation of leaders. Can you see the advancement of talent throughout the organization? Can you see the progression? Can you also see elements of diversity there, not just in terms of ethnic diversity, but are women well represented? Where are the disabled members of staff? And what are the policies in place to ensure that this isn't based on what one leader thinks is important, but it is within the culture of an organization? I'll stop there.
That's great. So many layers in that response, Ethel. Thank you so much, because there's so many things that can impact internally as well as the wider stakeholder. I know the IoD supports the Better Business Act and this entire concept that, you know, profit and purpose. So thank you for bringing all of that up. It's so important to remind ourselves when we're thinking about board governance on some of these issues. One of the things that is quite popular, I know, in large organizations, but also in the SME entrepreneurship space, is to really check out whether the board is working effectively. And who is it who's going to do that check? Because if they're the ultimate accountability body, who's going to do their assessment? They themselves might do a self-assessment, and many times that's included, but it's nice to kind of get an objective view in. So for all of you who are considering having boards or already have boards, we'd love to throw a little bit of light around board effectiveness. And again, I'd like to invite Roger and Ethel to talk a little bit about what really happens in board effectiveness, and what are you seeing emerging in the ones that you are perhaps supervising or have an insight into?
Yes,
Roger?
well, I think board evaluation can potentially achieve a number of things. I mean, at the most basic level, it can take a look at the board's processes, and structure and composition and benchmark them against other similar organizations. But I think actually the more value added element of a board evaluation goes well beyond that and really delves into the dynamics of the boardroom. It looks at the behavior within the boardroom. And I think as Hedvige was mentioning, one of the purposes of boards is to deliver genuinely group decision making based on the idea that if you bring many heads together with differing experiences and differing expertise, you can get to better decisions for the organization than if it's just one person, if it's just, as it were, decision making by a kind of dictatorship. However, there are many obstacles, I think, in the way of true group decision making. This is what board evaluation will be trying to look at. I mean, an obvious obstacle is if one person or a clique of persons is dominating decision making, and not all the voices around the table are being heard. But something which I think is a bit more difficult to diagnose and to truly get to the bottom of is groupthink amongst directors, which actually achieves the same thing in the sense that you're not getting genuine group decision making because everyone is thinking alike. You're actually getting a very narrowly focused way of thinking. And I think board evaluation can try and uncover that and also offer some potential solutions to it. I mean, the obvious solution is to try and have more diversity on the board in terms of the type of people that you have, and therefore make it less susceptible to groupthink. I think the way that chairmanship is delivered will also be crucial. How does the chair actually guide the discussion and bring people into debates? Even the order in which people are invited to contribute, and the level that the discussion is kept at, making sure that it doesn't go down too far into operational detail, but still remain relevant at a strategic level. So I think board evaluation is tremendously important from those perspectives, and it just gives the board an opportunity to step back from time to time and ask itself a question: are we really operating as a genuine board? And is there anything that we can learn from others that will help us to do this better?
Nice one there, Roger. Absolutely brilliant. Ethel, would you like to add on? And then I'll come back with a follow-up question on that one.
For sure. And I think, Roger, you mentioned a lot of the key points there. But to echo that, I think board effectiveness is also really important, and something that's often overlooked is assuming that people have all the skills that their CV might say that they have. In particular, so you might have somebody who's an accountant or somebody who's worked in financial directorships roles, but if you're an organization that's also involved in regulatory finance, the assumption's often made that somebody on the board understands what that means. But I think a key point of board effectiveness is also doing a skills audit, a thorough one, of thinking about what are the different areas of an organization that are really needed. And when people are retiring or people are stepping off boards, are we replacing the right skills? But also, are we doing that with an adequate or with a thorough look at people's backgrounds and experiences as well, beyond their CVs of what they're doing in the workplace? I think are really key important points for board effectiveness. But also thinking about multi-generational boards, I hear is something that's coming up in the Better Business Act as well. So how are we incorporating younger voices who might be within organizations, but also those who might be closer to retirement, but also those who are still operational and executive roles?
Brilliant. And that's such a great thing that's coming up, multi-generational voice into the boardroom. Also, how do you get customers who are future potential, not your customers' voice into the boardroom? So it's really about bringing in that immense view, which addresses the group thing, which seems to be emerging. I have a quick question from all the panelists before I move on to the next question, which is, I mean, you are there in boards, you're in board meetings. I'm not necessarily trying to pinpoint any particular company that you're working in, but what do you think is lacking most beyond groupthink? Is groupthink the biggest thing that you think is the problem? Or what would you reflect and say, these are a couple of things that could be better? Hatwish, I can see you've
No,
gone.
no, I think grouping, of course, Roger is right, but I think at the very heart of the companies today, there is a lack of diversity.
Okay.
That's clear. So in the first place, there is lack of diversity, and that's the key issue of today. It's not only diversity in terms of men and women, which of course I represent and I try to advocate for, but it's diversity in terms of age, background, beliefs, corporate experience, and then of course you have the groupthink. But in the first place, those different voices are not heard. And that's an even bigger problem.
Okay, great one for there. So diversity in the boardroom lacking out there. Ethel, what about you? What do you think is lacking? What do you see firsthand experience?
Echoing what Hedwig has just said about diversity, but I think also an appreciation of the customer, the end client, is often missing in boards. Because sometimes we're so focused on what's happening operationally and the risks we must be managing, we lose sight of the people who might be the ones walking into our shops or purchasing services don't look like us, and their experience of us might not be the one we actually hope or assume that they're having.
Absolutely, and that can lead to so many assumptions, which immediately starts limiting the decision-making powers of the board. Nice one out there. Abhi, what about you? What is it that you have found lacking?
I think sometimes there's a disconnect between the actual management and the board. A board is a much smaller organ, and it's a little easier to whether it's to affirm certain things and things you want to cultivate. But if the company itself that the board is overseeing is also not diverse in terms of what sort of people are in there, because you can have a diverse board and you can have a monolithic management that they're interacting with. And if you look at the career progression of the company itself, the opportunities, do they exist? You know, it's something that you need to actually actively work on. So it's not just the board, it's actually wider. It also goes to the heart of the company and everything. And you see people trying to lead things on that. I can give an example of Lewis Hamilton and what he's trying to do in Mercedes. You know, that he was the only person who looked like him in the entire company, all 2,000 people behind the car. You know, so it's those are the steps that need to take. And to tie into what Ethel is saying, the customers are not monolithic for most companies, you know, and everybody's pound is exactly the same. So they do reach out, even in their advertising, whatever it is, as the case may be. So it's from multiple fronts. That's what I would say, that we do need to try to make these changes. But the first thing is awareness, and there is an awareness now. People actually apologize when the face of the company is all monolithic, and I don't mean just in all ramifications, you know. So I think that matters is helpful, and people actually paying attention to it now. So I think the change is coming. Yes, thank you.
Nice one to highlight once again this importance of the management and how it is distinguished with the board. And you know, sometimes you hear about anecdotes about, is the board really driving the management, or is the executive team really influencing the board? Like, who is the person in charge, who's on the driving seat, and how do they work together and collaborate, and also the aspects about culture. So nice one there. Roger, you want to add in about a few other things that you find, or do you want to stress?
Yes, I will just add to what everyone else has said, perhaps by talking about diversity of something slightly different, and that's diversity of information sources that the board receives. And you know, I think, and when I do board evaluations, what I find a lot is that boards are very much rely on the management to supply them with their information. And you know, of course, that's inevitable to some extent, but you know, even with the best will in the world, what the management is providing them is one perspective. You know, it's the management's take on what is important, what matters. This is what you need to look at. And the board, I think, somehow needs to break free of that to develop its own independent perspective. And I think that involves the board speaking to different people, bringing along different perspectives to board meetings, getting independent experts, different types of stakeholder to come and speak to the board and provide their perspective, so that the board is really starting to be creative and be able to be creative in the way it's thinking about issues, and isn't just sort of passively being channeled in a certain direction by management that, of course, has a big advantage, especially over a non-executive board member who's just a part-time individual and not immersed in the business every day of the week.
Absolutely. Brilliant, brilliant. Diversity of information, another thought that could really help you strengthen the way that your boards are functioning. Now, Zubey, we'll come to you in a bit because there might be questions coming up. So call out to our audience if you'd like to ask any of our panel members any questions that you might have. But before we get on to that, I have one other question, because you've been talking a lot around diversity, and it's such a big, well, thankfully, it's a big sound out there, or at least I think it's a big sound and is the right sound and is having an impact. But I'd be curious to perhaps get a couple of points from Hatvish, you, and Abi, you, about diversity in the boardroom. We know it's required. We know it's important. Is it moving? Is the needle moving, or is it not? What's your viewpoint on that one?
Yes, so I will give an example, Rina. I am the CEO of the International Banking Federation. That means I represent federations of banks everywhere. And in the history of my company, it was always a native English speaker who was chairing the board, always. Right. Whether it was UK, you can imagine UK, US dominating the place. And that didn't feel right for me, because I thought if we want to be international, we need to have a non-native speaking. And so I had Japan in mind. Mm-hmm. That was for me the best way of having the next chair. But that was not obvious. I knew they were the oldest in town, they had the preference, but it took me 3 years, Rina, to convince Japan and convince the right person to do it. And finally, because language was a problem, I ended up with co-choosing with the organization a woman from their organization, and she will become the next chair. So what I mean, behind the scenes, there is a lot of work to be done to make that diversity happen. Because if you don't do it, you will end up with people, like-minded people, speaking the same language and not blending in the cognitive diversity. So it requires intentionality, and that's the same with women. If you want more women in the board, if you want people with diverse background, you will have to adapt to them. Because if they have to adapt to your thinking, you just don't have diversity. You just think you have, but you lose it. So there is an essential role for the chair. Whenever I chair my meeting at European Women on Boards, as Roger is saying, I speak the last one. I put something on the agenda, I prepare it with each member. Everyone gets to get his point, get a round table, and I speak at the very last. Because otherwise, if you start as a chair, you will not have a discussion. So cognitive diversity, that's why I think it's so important and so lacking. It is true, it is an interest, but it needs very good management, very good rules, very good understanding, and then be able to manage and to lead that diversity.
Nice one. Intentionality, persistent, and then the skills to really make it happen when you get the people. So important, because at the end of the day, as you know, we mentioned right at the beginning, board members are made of people, and guess what? People have unconscious biases, and one of them is the affinity bias, and therefore we need to watch out for that. So nice one out there. Abi, you want to add on to that?
Yes, thanks. I would concur with what Hedvig said. I think it's very important also to understand that the nature of boards and how they work actually lead to the very thing we're saying we need to avoid, which is the consensus, moving in harmony, everybody thinking the best for the organization. So these are forces that are acting actually against diversity. And the nature of boards, because of their strategic role, the larger the company, you need to be at a certain stage in your experience to be able to bring value to that board. You're not going to be fresh out of school and somebody says, oh, we need demographics, so let's have a student rep on the board or whatever. Or it just doesn't work that way. And these are things you need to always consider. And one thing I always like to add, and based on my practical experience, is that you need to have personality diversity.
Nice.
Because if you don't look beyond the CV, as I think one of my fellow panelists mentioned, you will have challenges. I can give real life example. One of my most effective directors didn't like to speak. Not very much. He was very reticent and everything, and you would mistake that, but he was very insightful in everything. And what did I discover as the chair? I discovered that he loved nothing more than a Saturday morning cup of tea. And I would pop by for his house for 20 minutes and I would gain valuable insight. So we had our tea sessions. We also had the ones that would dominate the conversation and everything. So part of, and particularly for SMEs, as you grow and you build out your board, you have to remember how people, the dynamics of human interaction actually impact your business. You know, so things like personality clashes and things like that, they have huge significance. And because they're not tangible, there are no metrics to say, what is there tension in the room or whatever. It creates a lot of challenges for the leadership in terms of maintaining board cohesion and balance and to serve the organization in the best possible way. So that is something that doesn't usually show up, but it actually does matter. You know, so if you're thinking of a non-exec, and they have a reputation for being a huge maverick or whatever as the case may be, but they're hugely successful in what they do, you know, you might want to, you know, just have a private think about that in terms of how is that going to impact the dynamics of the board, the management, and all of these things. So these are some of the things that it's not everything that's in the governance playbook, but in real life, we're all human beings and how we interact varies a great deal, especially today in this environment, because it's a lot of niceties have been put aside. People say what they think, when they think, however they want to say it, and it's going to impact governance and companies and all of that in the future. And you know, so that's one thing I wanted to add to that. Thank you.
Brilliant. And it's so important, the skillful part. So I'm loving that what both of you all have brought in is not only getting the people who are diverse personalities, thinking, information, all of that, but then being able to skillfully manage it as a chair, because there is that balance of being able to have enough discord and debate, but harmony as well. And that is something which is quite a delicate balance, and that comes with skill and experience. Great ones out there from the panel. I can see there are some questions out there. So Zube,
yes, indeed. Thank you. So I'll try and skillfully balance the questions. We have a couple from the audience right now. If anyone else has additional questions, please type into the Q&A. The first from Mark Bennett. He asks, any thoughts on governance within subsidiary legal entities whose parent company sits elsewhere? And how should we think about governance in UK subsidiaries? So I'll open this up to the entire panel.
Well, Rina, shall I come in here?
Please, Roger, go for it.
You know, being a director of a subsidiary, I think, is a very tricky situation, actually, because you may feel that you may not have that much power. You know, you're more or less informed what to do by head office, by the group entity, and you more or less have to go along with that. But what, of course, you mustn't forget is that in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the jurisdiction in which you're operating, you are legally responsible for that entity. It's not the people at head office who are legally responsible, and it's the regulator will come after you. And that indeed is why in many jurisdictions and in certain sectors, they insist on having a local legal entity, because they want to have people there that they can actually hold to account. So I think it's very important to set up an appropriate governance structure there, which defines in a very explicit way what your specific responsibilities are at the local level vis-a-vis the group. And companies do that in different ways. They may set up a group governance structure, which makes that very clear, and which then can, you know, the regulator can see who is responsible for what. But also, I think it's important as the subsidiary director that you make your point to the group entity and say, look, I need to take my responsibilities very, very carefully and very seriously. We need to set up an appropriate governance structure here at local level. I need to be trained as a director. And you shouldn't just assume that I'm going to accept what you tell me to do without any question. I need to show that I am exercising appropriate skill, care, and diligence in my role as a director, and to document that. So it's about professionalizing the role of subsidiary director, and not just thinking that you are, a level in the hierarchy that isn't really a true director. You are a true director. Nice
one. Hatwish, were you wanting to add on something? I can see it come up that you were going to answer live. So,
well, being from the banking industry, I can testify that it's fully right, and that in a banking entity there are very strict rules also with a supervisor that will hold the local entity accountable. And sometimes that can lead to a clash, because rules can be different and there can be confidentiality rules. But actually the very strict regime in the UK has helped, because board directors can use that kind of responsibility to say, no, this is my role. And also something that has not been addressed yet against group thinking is that if ever in a board you have a different opinion, you can always ask to have that opinion minuted.
Exactly.
So it is very important to make a difference between the role you have as a board director to challenge, to have an opinion, to be deliberate about that opinion, and to have that opinion in the minutes. And you can as well afterwards say, but if the board is deciding on a majority of vote, I will of course defend and uphold that decision. But there is something as a confidentiality of the discussion and the minuting, which is very important, because it's not about only one truth. The board, by essence, is discussing things where there is a lot of uncertainty. And so inviting board members to express opinions, each one, and you can have conflicting opinions, and it's only after having heard all the different opinions that the board comes to a decision, and that can be minuted. So that's important to say.
Yeah, thank you, Hedwish. And Abby, Ethel, would you like to add to that question?
I don't have a lot of expertise in this area. So I would probably, that's one of the things that you do need to know as a board member. When you don't have expertise, I'm not going to take a stab at it.
Absolutely, I so agree. And it's such a great point that Hatwish was also bringing about, is sometimes as a board member, you can't say, I didn't know, so therefore I'm not too sure why that decision was taken. And if you aren't, then to be able to minute it. So, but thank you for Abby for nicely role modeling the fact that when you don't know it, say it, I don't know it, and have the other experts talk about it. So well done there, Abby.
I was just going to add quickly that echoing a little bit of what Hedwig has just mentioned, especially in the UK, as long as you're listed as a director, like you're looked at in equal weighting, and every director has their 7 responsibilities as the basic starting point. And if people aren't sure what they are, they're available online. But every director has those as their primary responsibilities, and then following on whatever every company attributes to that.
Indeed. And it's those regulatory frameworks that one also has to keep in mind. I think the panel has highlighted those for us. So thank you. There's a second question in the Q&A segment. It's a really brief one from Aideen Duggan. And it says, would you know of many recruitment agencies that have a board? I am in NI, which I presume is Northern Ireland. It's quite a specific question, I imagine.
Yes.
But
so the recruitment agencies themselves, do they have a board? Yeah. Well, I get, of course, any corporate entity, which is a limited company, for example, will have a board by definition. You may not, you won't have a board, of course, if you are a sole trader or a partnership. Although even as a partnership, I'm sure you'll have some kind of managing body. But anything which is a corporate entity by definition will have a board of directors or a governing body of some kind.
What is interesting, Rina, is that I had lunch today with a lady who will be a D&I officer in a major recruiting company. So what is very, very encouraging is that you can see at the top recruiting firms now, who are very, very often asked to present board mandates or board candidates, the diversity is getting much more on the agenda. So that lady will be responsible to make sure that the database of that headhunter is more diverse. So I thought this was such a fabulous role to play on, and I really hope that other headhunters will follow.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
And it's so important being the recruitment agency. Sorry, Zubair.
Absolutely. No, I was just going to piggyback off that question, because within the young executives, we have many people that are new to directorship. And a question I usually get asked a lot of the time, it would be good to get the panel's contribution on this, is around the distinction. And you kind of touched on it just now, Dr. Barker, of non-executive directors, advisory boards, board directors, etc., part of that governance structure. So if you don't mind just shedding some light for our audience, that would be super.
Yes, certainly. I think the point to make is that there are two broad types of director: executive directors and non-executive directors. And executive directors are actually fulfilling two roles at the same time. They are both a director of the company, and they're also a manager of the company, and so therefore also an employee of the company. So they're having to juggle two hats. The non-executive director role is actually more straightforward, because you are pure and simply a director of the company. You're not an employee, you're not subject to employment law, you hold an office within the company. So it's there are all sorts of ramifications, though. One important one is how you are paid. As an executive director, especially of large companies, you tend to have a remuneration structure which is very performance oriented, perhaps with a long-term incentive plan, maybe with share options, a bonus, as well as your salary. But as a non-executive director, you generally don't get any of that, and you probably are not going to become a mega rich person as a non-executive director. You're going to receive a fee for fulfilling that role, but generally speaking, your pay won't be performance related. And the reason it's not performance related is to give you a different way of looking at the company and its performance, which allows you to be more independent relative to the executive.
And I wonder, might that be an opportunity to really level up the role and the impact of the non-executive directors around value creation and how they get remunerated for it? I wonder.
I think in smaller companies, I think this is an interesting question, that small companies, they may want to appoint a non-executive director, but they don't have lots of money available, to pay them large fees. And especially if you're a startup, but you want to benefit from that experience, that know-how. And so the way to do that may be to grant options to that person to come on board and say, look, we're not going to pay you anything now, but help us to succeed, and then you will benefit. When it comes to larger companies, though, that kind of pay structure is frowned upon, because it sort of blurs the distinction between being an executive and a non-executive. But certainly I think for the SME, that could be a way of getting experienced non-execs on board to help you.
Nice one.
Absolutely.
Zubair, just noticed that Keith has raised his hand there, and if I don't pay any attention to that, he's going to have a chat with me later on. So might we call him on board? Yes.
Sure, Keith? Of course.
Thank you. I've just noticed a question in the chat. So I'm conscious of time, but I'm not sure if anybody particularly in the panel wants to answer this one. Are you seeing environmental, social, and governance reporting becoming a useful tool to assess executive leadership team performance? That's from Lorraine.
Nice one. I know there's a recent thing that the IoD is also signed up as following the COP26. So Roger would love it if whether you could bring in some comments, but certainly Abby, Ethel, Hatfish, want to respond to that one? Ooh, silence. I like it when we have the panel go silent. Should it be? And if so, in what shape and form should it be done?
Yes, I think we can say, Rina, it was in your panel before. that the big items that we have on the board table today, which are the pandemic, the digital transformation and environment, all are extremely disrupting and extremely complicated to manage. So if you do not have that diversity at the table just yet, it's too late. I mean, all these three items have never been thought in any business school before. So you really need to be able to have that conversation, a bit like Ethel was saying. COVID, environment, for example, they have hit women, they've hit the people from less privileged environment much harder than all of us who are sitting comfortably in our office or lounge. So if you do not have that voice at the table, how can you imagine the business model of the future? What will happen to your clients of the future? So we need much more than just the same people as we know already. We need to have those voices at the table and give them a say, invite them to the table, invite also to challenge. And that's again a very important gift of the chair, to give that comfort and say, I would like you to step up and challenge us. Then you give that person a role to play, because that's the only way that that person will be a good say and a help at the table.
Nice. So now that, and Zube, this might well be a great conversation for us to continue within the roundtable that happens straight after, around how we could really up the game on the ESG, because that is quite kind of encompasses a lot of issues there itself, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's one final question, if we have time to squeeze it in, from Anne Wolf in the Q&A. It's straight to the point, and it's around what has been referred to earlier on supporting SMEs. Is it acceptable practice to offer your services free of cost to an SME to get the experience you need as a NED?
I would come in here, and some years ago we did a survey of IoD members who were serving as directors, and actually it turned out a significant proportion of them were doing the job for free. They were doing it because they wanted to help. They wanted to share their experience and their expertise and their insights, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Of course, though, one has to recognize that when you become a director of the smallest company to the largest, you are taking on personal, legal and financial liability. So you do need to bear that in mind. I remember when there was a controversy in the charity sector. You may remember when Kids Company collapsed, and the board of trustees of Kids Company were actually pursued by the Charity Commission. And some of them turned around and said, look, you can't go after us because, we were doing this as a way of giving back. We weren't receiving any fee. This was a kind of voluntary philanthropic activity that we were offering. Well, even though eventually, of course, they were cleared of any wrongdoing, that argument that just because I'm doing this as a kind of charitable endeavor, that removes my liability, I'm afraid that doesn't wash. You assume liability. So, but in principle, I mean, good for you if you're able to help an SME or a charity.
And on that note, I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this segment before we move on to the next segment. But before we do, I'd just like to express our thanks to the panel. Dr. Roger Barker, Ethel Tambuzai, Hedridge, and Abi Ayuda. Warm round of applause to each of you for sharing your frank comments and contributions on the panel. So there's a link that's going to be shared, which would be directing us to the Zoom. I'll hand over to Rina for final closing remarks before we move on to the networking segment. Thank you.
Just going to echo your thanks. What a great conversation. I could have continued, and we will continue for the next half an hour, but thank you so much. Absolutely a pleasure to be here. Keith, over to you to be able to close up today's conversation. Thank you everyone for being here, and see you in a bit. Keith, you might.
Sorry. Multitasking. I've just put the Zoom link into the chat for everybody. Hopefully you can stay with us for the VIP roundtable. But yes, again, just to thank everybody for engaging so much tonight. Thank you to our panelists as always. Bit of a plug, IoD. So the slides have disappeared. It's probably a good thing, but Coronavirus Support Hub is still live on IoD.com. The IoD Academy has never stopped. It's still there. And as I mentioned earlier, the IAS Information Advisory Service. More importantly for tonight, we continue the conversation about board governance crisis. Like I said, the link for the VIP roundtable and networking is in the chat. So we will be moving over to that very shortly. Hope you can follow us there. And let's talk. I'm going to do a countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2. Thank you all.